One thing that really blew my mind, I assumed, probably like most people, that when we sleep, we are mostly unconscious, except maybe when we dream, and everybody knows that we only remember some dreams, but not many. But otherwise, I thought I'm mostly unconscious. I modified DES, Descriptive Experience Sampling, by trying to do it while I was sleeping. And I tried doing a nap, and I tried doing the night, and I realized that almost always I was conscious.
Gualtiero Piccinini is a philosopher and consciousness researcher who's been quietly tearing up my map of inner life. For the last 10 weeks, he's helped me investigate my own inner experience alongside Dr. Russell Hurlburt, the inventor of the experience sampling method. Russ has spent 5 decades refining a deceptively simple technique that answers questions people assume they already know. Do I have an inner voice? How often do I talk to myself? Can I see mental images, and what do they look like? His findings are radical. Many people don't inner speak at all, and our intuitions about our own minds are often wrong. The method itself is elegant and brutal. A device beeps at random times, and your job is to report what was in your experience immediately before the beep. Then you're interviewed, and through patient, precise back and forth, you converge on what actually happened inside your mind. It's actually harder than it sounds, and it exposes surprising truths about how we think. My episode with Russ went viral and became the most watched video on my channel. This conversation with Gualtiero is no less revealing. We both bring our own sampled experiences to the table and then use them as a lens to ask a bigger question. Could careful first-person science be the key to unlocking consciousness? Subscribe to discover why your inner monologue might be lying to you and what that means for who you are.
We don't really have one single stream of consciousness. That's, William James's term. But we have, say, between 1 and 4 streams, depending on circumstances. They're not aspects of one and the same experience. They're not unified,
I wonder what the upper bound of that, like how many spotlights can one person have in their awareness truly in any one time? I think it was pretty common for me to have at least 2 or 3. What do you think that reveals about consciousness, that it's not all integrated into one thing? It's not really one stream of consciousness. There is multiple spotlights. There is multiple streams of awareness.
I do think that's very significant. I think it's under theorized and under appreciated. At the very least, it requires some nuance or modification of our theories of consciousness, meaning
Gualtiero Piccinini, what is the most surprising thing you've learned about your inner experience through the process of experience sampling?
Hi, Evan. So there's one thing that really blew my mind. I assumed, probably like most people, that when we sleep, we are mostly unconscious, except maybe when we dream, and everybody knows that we only remember some dreams, but not many. But, we dream more than what we remember. But otherwise, I thought I'm mostly unconscious. It's only doing a REM sleep that we dream. Otherwise, nothing is going on in your mind. So I modified DES, Descriptive Experience Sampling, by trying to do it while I was sleeping. And I tried doing a nap, and I tried doing the night. And I realized that almost always I was conscious.
Wow. Explain that.
So the sleep researchers distinguish 4 types of sleep. So there's REM sleep while we dream, and there's N1, N2, N3. N3 is deep sleep, and it's only a limited amount of time every night, the deepest phase. And when I was able to do descriptive experience sampling during that phase, I could not recall any experience. So at least at that moment, I think we really are unconscious. But during the other phases, which I'm inferring I was in, I would the beep from DES would catch me with some kind of thought, not a dream, some kind of thought, typically some kind of propositional thought. I'm thinking about something being impossible, or the house needs work or something like that. And I would immediately forget it. So, these examples that I'm giving are exceptions. Typically, I would immediately forget what it was that I was thinking about. I just remembered there was something distinctive that I was thinking about. But by the time I had to try to write notes about what it was gone. But still, this is, to me, like really an amazing discovery, in the sense that I expected that I would not be conscious most of the time, but instead I was
Right.
almost always thinking of something consciously that I could access, at least at that very moment of the beep. Like I knew there was something happening, and then I would quickly forget it.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
First off, you're a psychopath for wanting to do this while asleep. Like I value my continued sleep too much to have this beeping noise wake me up 6 times in 4 hours. That sounds pretty miserable. Did you do the same amount of beeps, or you said you modified the experience? Talk about what.
I would do only one per night.
Right.
So I wouldn't keep doing it during the night, just once every night. But I did that for a while, enough to convince me that this is a pattern. It's not a fluke. And I looked up what sleep researchers find, and they do find similar things. I don't think they're as precise or as rigorous as DES is, and they're kind of vague about what what people are experiencing. Sometimes they just use the word dream for everything that people report while they're asleep. But I would distinguish very sharply between a dream in the normal sense, which is a kind of um, sequence of images, like almost like a movie in your head, in which happens automatically, and it's experienced in a kind of sensory way, versus propositional thoughts, where like you're thinking, oh, I need to get the house in order, without any images. You're not visualizing the house, nothing's happening, in your imagination. It's just like a straightforward thought. And so that's what I was experiencing, sometimes like little images, but not like a dream. That's what I was experiencing when I wasn't dreaming. And yeah, of course I also dream. That's another thing.
Really interesting. So would you
Yeah.
say those beeps were any different to a fully wakeful dream when you were doing experience sampling during the day and you were sitting at your desk and working? Was the type of experiences you had in this sleep just pretty much identical to a wake state?
No,
No.
no, not identical. Because for one thing, when you're awake, you also have all this sensory stuff happening at the same time. So you might have a thought in addition to the visual experience, auditory experience, or whatever it is. Some of which you might be, consciously entertaining, whereas the rest is just sort of happening in the background. And then none of that is happening when you're asleep. There's nothing sensory happening. It's also much more, I want to say, faded, and also there's no sense of agency. Even during the day, often like thoughts just kind of follow each other in a semi-automatic way. But during the sleep, while you're sleeping, I mean, I could barely be aware of the thought that I was having at that moment without really knowing where the whole thing was coming from. There was no memory of how I got there or where I'm going with it. There's no like sense of planning or reasoning actively about it. And I guess the biggest difference is I immediately forget almost everything.
Right.
So there's no ability of the brain to retain this information. It's some kind of, maybe it's like the brain training itself. I don't know, or like trying to find patterns or information in what it already has, but none of it gets stably retained in a way that you can access at the moment and write down notes about. So
Interesting.
yeah, so lots of differences, very, very different.
Do you track your stages of sleep? Were you able to correlate the sampling experiences with like a sleep tracker and say, oh, I was in a particular stage of sleep, and you correlate that with the experience?
I didn't do that with any kind of tracker. I want to try that though.
Yeah,
Um, I want to go back to it eventually, like when I start writing about this, because I want to write about it.
for sure.
And I think it's a great idea to use some kind of Fitbit or tracker that gives me the external information about what phase of sleep I'm in. When I say I was in this phase of sleep, it's like an inference. It's an inference based on what I understand to be the features of different phases of sleep. And also
What
when it happened in the night, because I timed the beep to happen, 60 minutes into when I went to sleep at night. And that's when, like, usually you hit
okay.
the deepest phase of sleep.
Really interesting. What do you take that to mean? I mean, that's not conventional sleep literature that we're having some sequence of kind of conscious events, but we're sleeping, so we're not aware of the conscious events. But if something does wake you up, you're able to kind of think back to that state and kind of very briefly get some essence of that experience that you were having. What do you take that to mean? That's not conventional sort of sleep science, and it's very strange, right? I mean, the essence of sleep, if you're not dreaming, is that you're not supposed to be conscious, right? You're not supposed to have that awareness.
Right.
That's like the definitionally.
With maybe like some exceptions, like maybe once in a while you might have like some flash of something, but yeah, normally you should be resting or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I guess you're resting, but the rest does not mean what we think it means most of the time. Meaning it doesn't mean that your brain turns off. It means that it's just working in a different way. Um, so, so yeah, I think there's a lot of things to extract from this. One is that descriptive experience sampling is a very valuable method for studying the mind that is underutilized. Um,
For
Second
sure.
one is that we're a lot more conscious than we think we are, even when we sleep. There's probably things to figure out about what the function of all of that is. Like,
Right.
why are we still conscious even while we sleep? What is the purpose? What is the function of those thought patterns that happen there? And to be fair, neuroscience and sleep science have evolved in recent years to pay much more attention to sleep and the function of sleep and the function of sleep and cognition. So, I mean, there's a lot of like really good neuroscience now, studying, for example, how, in mice, let's say, you can find a lot of similar neural patterns of activation that mirror the same patterns that occur while the mouse is asleep and exploring the environment when the mouse is asleep. So you can see the same neurons doing the same things that they do when the mouse is awake, and they do them when the mouse is asleep.
Right.
So, so I think that's very fascinating, and it fits with my experience using DES, where, okay, yeah, I was thinking about things, even though I immediately forget what it was. Um, so yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from this.
Do you think, would you say it's distinct from long uninterrupted dreaming, but would you consider those conscious moments little maybe micro pockets of dreaming? Would you consider it dreaming? No, you think it's distinct?
Yeah, I think it's something very different,
Interesting.
and it feels very different. It feels very different from a dream. It's more like maybe a train of thought. I'm guessing, because it's hard to know how these things evolve over time. I get the beep and I get like a glimpse into it at that moment, and I forget even what that was. So certainly I can't remember how it got to be that way. Um, but I, but I've had like, um, I've had another kind of experience that suggests that this is ongoing, and I can tell you what it was. But I also remembered another moral of this story that I can tell you if you
Do
want.
it, please.
Um, I think that people in consciousness studies underestimate the importance of um, global states of consciousness global states of the brain for consciousness. So, there's this whole like program of looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, which I think is very valuable and difficult to do, especially without using descriptive experience sampling. I think that would help. Um, but I think that there is a broader set of conditions that need to be in place for the brain to be able to be conscious. And consciousness itself is not just all or nothing, either you're conscious or you're not. There's a whole spectrum of options.
Right.
So there's the kind of consciousness that we have when we're normally awake. Even then, there's like lots of differentiation depending on how rested versus tired we are, what kind of substances we have in our bloodstream, and so forth. But then there are these phases of sleep. And so there's dreaming, which is quite different, but has some similarities to wakeful consciousness. Then there's these other types of consciousness or this other type that we can experience glimpses of using DES, like I did. And I think it's in like N1 and N2. Those are like the non-REM sleep phases that are not the deepest phase. And then there's the deepest phase. And that's where I was going to go with this other experience that I have that suggests that it depends on the state of arousal of your brain. And then when the brain is aroused even a little bit, like it just kind of lights up and some thoughts just happen. Do you want me to tell you about that?
It's so interesting. Yeah, like absolutely. So I've been trying to drink less alcohol. And honestly, it's had a pretty big impact on my health. I'm sleeping better, I'm exercising more, and my business is growing. The data suggests that people are drinking less alcohol than ever, which overall I think is great, but I'm still looking for a little treat at the end of the workday or a hard workout. And that's where Sentia comes in. Sentia is a 0% alcohol drink that feels like you're drinking something special without any of the downsides. It's created by neuroscientists and it's designed to give you that relaxing buzz, the same kind of feeling you get from alcohol, but without the hangover, brain fog, or impact on sleep quality. And it tastes absolutely delicious. They already have a GABA red berry, which is perfect to mix with a tonic or orange, or GABA black, which is awesome with Coke. Personally, I've been really enjoying the GABA gold with Fanta lemon on ice.
It's actually genuinely delicious. Like, I'm not even play acting there. It's actually just really, really good.
So you might be wondering, how does a drink with 0% alcohol give you that buzz? It almost sounds too good to be true. Well, this is the really cool neuroscience part. The secret is GABA, the brain's natural calming agent. And the different GABA flavors have different cognitive effects. Sentia's founder, Dr. David Nutt, has published over 500 independent research papers and written 34 books on neuropharmacology. What Dr. Nutt realized was that we can harness the same calming, relaxing effects from alcohol without any of the side effects. I genuinely think this could be the future of drinking. And they're also just releasing their first beer and stout, which as an Irishman I am dying to compare to Guinness. Sentia are offering my viewers 10% off their first purchase, and I genuinely could not recommend it more. I think even if you're looking to just substitute your one gin and tonic on a Tuesday with Sentia, the accumulative health benefits over time will actually be very noticeable. So check out Sentia, again 10% off at checkout.
So even though when I was in the deepest phase of sleep, generally I could not remember any experiences or any thoughts when I got woken up. And the thing is, it's very hard to wake up from that phase of sleep. So it's not enough to just hear a beep. Usually it takes a while even for the beep. So you've done DES, so you know how it is. Like you have it in your ear and it beeps like a sharp beginning and you hear the very beginning. And so it just tells you like right there, like, boom, focus on what's happening. But when you're in deep sleep, you don't hear it at first at all. It might go on for minutes and you still don't hear it. You don't hear anything. So what I did is I switch from a continuous beep to an intermittent signal, still sharp, but it would just kind of, it's more similar to an alarm, like a classic alarm, like beep, 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 like that, very sharp in my ear still, and made it as loud as possible because I
God.
wanted to see if it could wake me up as quickly as possible so that I wouldn't interfere with whatever might have been going on in my mind, if anything.
Yeah.
And a few times, what I ended up experiencing was this intermittent flashes of quasi thoughts, I want to call them, not sensory, not even the beep. Like I couldn't hear the beep yet, but I would have these little flashes, like maybe I could remember 3 or 4, in which like I was having like the beginning of a thought and then it would just die, and then the beginning of a thought and it would die at
Interesting.
the pace of the beep. So what I think was happening is that the beep of the alarm, the intermittent beep, was at some point reaching causing enough stimulation that my brain, or what some parts of my brain, would sort of get activated and start forming a thought. And then since the beep stopped, that would just die. And then it would start again and then die. And then it would start again. And then after 3 or 4 of those, I would hear the beep and I would wake up. So by the time
Interesting.
I'm hearing the beep, then it wakes me up. And then I'm thinking, what is going on? And I mean, because the first time it was really eerie, like this whole like flashes of thought, I'm thinking like, oh, maybe that's what's happening in my mind. But I think it was driven by this intermittent beeping.
Very interesting. Did
Yeah.
you have any hypotheses going in? Did you do this for any reason of like, I just want to experiment with this, I don't know what will happen? Did you predict any of this, that you would have an experience?
I predicted that under some circumstances I would have experiences. And the reason for that is that I have done meditation for 30 years of various sorts. And at least during naps during the day, which is, I guess, in some ways a different type of sleep than night sleep, I remember several times being aware during the nap. So, like falling asleep, but remaining aware and then waking up and never losing awareness, or consciousness during the nap. So, I knew that this was possible, that you can be conscious while you sleep without having a dream. Of course, we all know about dreams, that's not in question. So I knew it was possible, but I didn't know that it was so extensive. So I thought
Right.
most likely during a nap, I will be able to notice some experience going on because I knew that this was happening. I had experienced it before without the beep. But I thought surely during the night, I'm going to be mostly unconscious. But that was not the case.
It's funny because it kind of reminds me of the stories of Einstein with the metal balls. I think it was Einstein. He used to like have metal balls in his hand and used to go for these naps. And then once he fell asleep, the ball would fall onto a plate, smash it, and wake himself up. I think I might be. It might be a different scientist, but I think it's Einstein.
I don't
Um,
know. I don't know. I think I heard something like that. I don't know if it was about Einstein, but something like that. But why was he doing this?
it was supposed to be that he got those glimpses of insight in those sort of fugue states between like consciousness and sleep, and apparently he had those brilliant insights. Now I don't know, about half of what you hear about Einstein is probably just fiction, all the quotes and stuff that are true, so it might never have happened at all. But I'm curious, did you have any brilliant insights of your work, or deep consciousness light bulb moments, eureka moments in these sort of waking sort of states?
Uh, well, what I can say is there is a relatively influential view that um, some of what happens during sleep involves creative thinking. And there are, like, at least anecdotal reports by scientists or other creative people that they go to sleep having a problem and they wake up and they know the solution to the problem. Like one famous example, I think, was like Kekulé, who discovered the molecular structure of benzene, and
Yeah.
it came to him in a dream, of a snake biting its tail or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that idea has been around for a long time, and I buy that. Certainly, it fits my experience. Meaning, regardless of whether I wake up during the night, I think sleep helps reach new ideas, solutions. Yeah, and that sometimes it does happen in the middle of the night. Like I wake up and I have something, and if I don't write it down, I will forget it by the morning. So that's
Yeah.
why I'll take a note, or I'll make a reminder in my phone. Um, I don't think that DS has particularly enhanced that, but it hasn't hurt it either.
Yeah.
But it does
Let,
happen.
And how was your memory in recalling these? I know you said you forget it, so you have to write it down right away. When Russ was going through the sort of interrogation, and he's saying, "Well, were you thinking those words, or were you, was it in your accent? Was there a temporal dimension?" All of those questions that he asks in, were you able to kind of bring yourself back into that moment at all and actually relive it? Because through my own experience sampling, in the sort of questioning phase, you would somewhat get little glimpses of the experience, or at least I would. Maybe I'm not sure if you resonate with that, but I would be able to go back into that moment and think, okay, maybe I actually was slightly thinking about this, or maybe this was in my visual field, or were you able to kind of relive that experience, or was it just wiped?
That is a very good question. For one thing, I have aphantasia, so I don't really imagine things vividly. That
Yes.
doesn't mean that I don't have any recollection of things. I do, but it doesn't involve vivid images of things. Um, so I certainly would not say I am able to like relive experiences similarly to how I lived them before if they had a kind of vivid sensory aspect. Um, so yeah, I did my best to remember enough information to answer Russ's questions. But often I reached the limits of my memory, and I said, either I don't recall enough to answer that question, or I don't think that question really makes sense enough based on what I remember to be my experience at the time. So yeah,
Right.
but there's certainly a gap between the moment of the experience. There's many gaps. There's the experience as you have it. There is how the beep basically motivates you to focus on whatever you can focus on of that experience. You can't focus on every aspect of it, but you try to figure out as much as possible of what's happening. Then there's the how much you can remember before you write it down. So some information might be lost by the time you write it down.
Right.
And then, hours later, Russ is asking you questions about it. And luckily you have notes. Otherwise, in my case, I'd be very lost. So you use the notes, and then you use if anything else you remember that might not have been written in the notes to try to answer his questions. I do think his questions are excellent, and they
Yeah.
really help to um, find a intelligible and accurate description of at least salient aspects of the experience you were having at the moment.
For sure.
But
He
it's
acts like
tricky. It's tricky, and he's very aware of that.
you can tell that he's literally been doing it for 50 years, right? I mean, in my conversation with him, which obviously it kind of blew up and got so many comments, and I loved going through them, and people were commenting about, oh, he's so pedantic, like he won't answer any questions specifically. And I'm like, that's kind of his job. Or like he's really trying to be specific with what words he uses, because people don't know their own inner experience. And every time you think you're recalling it, it's like 70% certainty. And then it's his questions that really do act as a guide of like, oh, okay, I didn't make that distinction in my head. Like we have had so many conversations now of trying to tease apart, is something inner speech or a thought, right? That's like a big one. And it's his sort of questions that it's like, okay, well, how do you how do you actually distinguish between these two things? And he really does act as a guide in figuring it out. Funny also, I would say by far the most common comment that people made on that video is people describing their own inner experience with just 100% certainty. So, like, no one was even slightly doubtful of their own experience, which the main takeaway that we talked about was people don't have a good idea of their own inner experience. But somehow everyone missed this and they were like, I experience all five of the freaking phenomena all of the time. I'm literally inner speaking constantly. And it's funny just how that was almost the main message of that podcast and nobody got it. Everyone just likes to match. Everyone likes to match. Like, I definitely inner speak. I definitely have lots of unsymbolized thinking. I inner see lots. You know, I find that so funny.
Yes, and it applies in among experts too. So in philosophy, you know, I'm a philosopher, and in philosophy, it's so common to read people say, well, you know, introspectively, you know this, you have access to this, you can experience this. And it's just this very vague, unrigorous appeal to essentially your own untrained intuitions about what you can and cannot access introspectively, with like
Right.
no effort to check or no awareness of the challenges of doing proper introspection of experience.
Yeah.
So yeah. So Russ is on a whole different level from like almost everyone else. He's like beyond grandmaster level with respect to these things.
For sure. For sure. Let's get to your wakeful experiences. Was there anything in your wakeful experiences that surprised you, that you realized throughout the experience that you maybe didn't hypothesize before going into descriptive experience sampling?
The one thing that comes to mind that I wasn't as aware of is how many things I could be experiencing at the same time without
Right.
them being part of the same thing or part of the same experience.
Right.
So I would say most of my samples range from a one item that was just the one and only thing I was focusing on at that moment up to four. So that means that, you know, we don't really have one single stream of consciousness. That's, you know, William James's term. But we have, say, between 1 and 4 streams, depending on circumstances. And that's counterintuitive, I think, to many people, because, including myself, because we know we have this idea that there is like the one stream of consciousness, but really sometimes I was thinking something and feeling something with part of my body, and also looking at something and experiencing something visually. And then maybe there was also something else, you know, or like something I was hearing at the same time. And they're not like the same, you know, they're not aspects of one and the same experience. They're not unified. You know, it's not like
Right.
I'm looking at you and hearing your voice at the same time. I might be, you know, looking at your nose and noticing how gorgeous it is while also hearing my dog barking in the background, while also feeling something with my elbow, and at the same time thinking something about, you know, what I'd have to do later. So all of
Right.
this could be happening at the same time in my conscious experience.
Right. It's a good point. We often talk about the spotlight of consciousness, but it's really not one spotlight.
Yeah.
It's actually multiple spotlights, and I wonder what the upper bound of that. Like, how many spotlights can one person have in their awareness truly in any one time? I think it was pretty common for me to have at least two or three.
Yes.
You know, I would have some bodily experience, something from my legs, usually tired from exercise, and then I would be looking at a screen and have some sensory awareness, either some colors on the screen or a face or something. I seem to be drawn to colors and faces. And then maybe or maybe not, I was thinking or inner speaking, and they would all be going on at once. And you would have some idea of the ratio, not fully, but you might be able to say that was maybe 40 to 50%, and then this was 20. Obviously, pretty large error bars on that, but you could tell that one was definitely more, the spotlight was bigger on one experience than other. What do you what do you think that reveals about consciousness? You know, sort of how I got into this field, and I'd be really curious to hear how you got really interested in your experience after, was how it sort of connects into this broader picture of consciousness. You know, what do you think that reveals about consciousness, that it's not all integrated into one thing? It's not really one stream of consciousness. There is multiple spotlights, there is multiple streams of awareness. What do you think that says?
Yeah.
Do you think it says anything?
Yeah, I think it does say something important, and I also am agreeing with you that in both of our cases, I think the typical experience involves between 2 and 3 different thoughts or experiences going on at the same time. So it's more the exception than the rule that there's only one, or
Right.
that there's more than 3. But still, uh, I think I do think that's very significant. I think it's under theorized and under
Mm,
appreciated, and at the very least, it requires some nuance or modification of um, our theories of consciousness. Meaning, one of the most influential, for example, says that consciousness is what happens when things get broadcast in the global workspace,
right.
which would be short-term memory. Okay, you put in short-term memory, and people think short-term memory must be like some place in your mind where you put things. But what it looks like from the inside when you do descriptive experience sampling is more like things kind of can become more present into your consciousness. You can be conscious of them, and they can and this can come from any place in your mind. So it's more of a degree of arousal and activation of a process over others, and there's different systems in the mind that can do this largely independently of each other at the same time. um, and so there's probably, and of course, this is still the tip of the iceberg, or the icebergs, of all the processes that are going on. So there's all kinds of things that you could be conscious of, but normally you're not.
Right.
Like there's lots of things around you that you can see, hear, touch, feel, and so forth. But at any moment, you're only consciously aware of a few of those things, maybe 2 or 3. Um, Also, lots of things you could be thinking about, and you're only thinking about one or a few at a time. Um, there's the like vast, submerged iceberg of all the processes that are going on, and then the few things that emerge at any given moment. And certainly there is some kind of independence between at least some of these things, how they can happen to, in parallel, even consciously in parallel. So consciousness itself is not just like a single sequential stream, but
Yes.
multiple parallel streams that probably, like they come to consciousness for a little bit and then they get submerged again because there's something else that catches your attention more.
Right. Do you think consciousness has a hub in the brain, or do you think it's fully distributed, or somewhere in between? Is there nodes of consciousness? Is there a single command center, or is it fully distributed? Where would you lean now, where what the evidence says, with experience sampling, with everything you know?
I definitely distribute it because, the feeling also when you do descriptive experience sampling is that this stuff happens largely on its own. Um, and that's another pitfall of introspection, of like armchair introspection or standard introspection, like driven by instructions, driven by decision, where like you decide to introspect. Well, by the time you've decided, you've already shaped your experience in a certain way.
Right.
Um, so it's not that there's nothing to learn there, but you have altered the functioning of your mind. And so you're going to catch that, the way your mind operates after you've changed it by deciding that you're going to introspect a certain way. Whereas the beauty of DES is it kind of catches you as things happen on their own. And the experience there is, well, things just kind of do happen on their own, largely in an automated way. So yeah, once in a while you make a decision, you're actively trying to do something, and that's fine. And you can even catch catch an experience of that. But a lot of it is just, yeah, you have some kind of meta processes, cognitive control that decides what you're engaging in and what your goals are. But then, what comes to your consciousness during that and what you're focusing on is largely driven by like these a million different things, sensory
Yeah.
cues, and the process itself, how the process unfolds, what you need to do to get to where you're trying to go, and so forth.
Right.
Um, so I think, yeah, it's very, very distributed. It's conditioned. It's modulated by your goals and your and therefore some kind of control systems that influence it. But then it unfolds on its own, and it unfolds based on anything that's relevant. It could be auditory, somatosensory. It could be gustatory, olfactory. It could be all kinds of thoughts that are relevant, memories, emotions. It all happens at the same time,
Right.
everywhere in the brain, or
Right.
not everywhere, but in lots of different places.
Right, right. No, I would agree. That seems right to me. Having it in one location. I think one of the biggest reasons for me of why it likely isn't in one location is it seems like we probably would have found it, maybe. Like if it was in one location and all of consciousness was occurring in one location and we've scanned millions of brains, that we wouldn't find something pretty specific or unique happening in one area that just looks distinctly unique or different from the rest. But it being a distributed process and sort of melting into the noise kind of makes a lot more sense. Did you have like a standard beep, or was there so much variance between your experiences that it would be hard to say? Because I've only done my own sampling now, so I haven't actually really heard of anyone else's like standard beeps. Like, what were your most prevalent of the phenomena that you experienced?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there was a standard, but one thing that I did predict, and Russ was very skeptical of that because he's always skeptical of people's preconceptions. But I was right about it, and he agreed that I was right. Is that I have virtually no inner speech. Um,
No inner speech.
no inner speech. So my
Interesting.
thoughts are all quote unquote unsymbolized. Insofar as there's like propositional thoughts. They don't come with words that are produced inside of me. That's also counterintuitive. A lot of people, and you, when you started, said you predicted there would be a lot of inner speech, but
Yes.
there was some, but not a
No, I
ton.
haven't had nearly as much as I would have thought. No, which is
Yeah.
interesting. I haven't, and I still kind of again want more variance of samples because I think I
Yeah.
interspeak more when I'm going on walks, things like this, when I'm not preoccupied at my desk working. So again, I need more samples to really gain an idea of when I interspeak. But definitely with the samples I have, yeah, I haven't had as many samples of experience inner speech as I would have thought. For sure, that was a big thing for me.
And this reinforces your message from before. It says it's not as easy as you think to know how
Really not.
your consciousness operates. And um and the reason that I was able to make this prediction about myself is simply that I had done a mock descriptive experience sampling on myself years ago when I read Russ's work or some of it. And I learned, I found out about this idea that a lot of thoughts are not inner speech; they are like unsymbolized, as he says.
Yeah.
And it kind of blew me away because I had never thought of it, and I had never considered that possibility. And I thought, what? Like, that sounds wrong. Like, certainly when we're thinking, there's got to be some inner speech. So I did my own little simplified version using maybe some kind of alarm sound. I don't remember exactly what I used. And I caught myself with unsymbolized thoughts. And virtually every time that I had thoughts, they were unsymbolized already at the time. This was maybe more than 15 years ago. And so that's what convinced me instantly that A, Russ was onto something,
Yeah.
and B, that my thoughts were largely unsymbolized, and that's why I could make that prediction. But
Really
yeah,
interesting.
otherwise I would have been wrong myself. I would have said, yeah, surely I think in inner speech.
I think was also, I probably got 1,000 comments along this line of what's the difference between inner speech and thinking. Maybe we should lay out that distinction that we've sort of been able to arrive at. What do you think is the main difference between inner speech and thinking or unsymbolized thought?
Good question. And I would clarify that inner speech is a kind of thinking. So thinking, at least in this framework,
Yes.
divides into inner speech, which is thoughts that are experienced as being made out of specific words where you can list the words. The words are expressed not overtly, not verbally, but in your head, one after the other. So, if you're thinking the cat is on the mat in inner speech, first you're thinking the word then you're thinking the word cat, then you're thinking the word on, and so forth. They come one after the other, and it can have more features than that. It could have an accent, it could have a tone. But if you are thinking the cat is on the mat in unsymbolized form, there's no words, you're not experiencing any words, let alone one word after the other, because there are no words, so they can't be one after the other. There can't be an accent or a tone to the words because there are no words.
Yeah.
So what you experience is just the content that the cat is on the mat all at once. It's all like well formed. That that's what you're thinking, and maybe you could express it in slightly different words, and it would be just equally good. So you choose some words to express it. You express what you're thinking, but you don't have to use just this particular word. So maybe you could use the kitties on the mat, and it would just be equally good.
Yeah.
Um,
The concept is the same. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so yeah, so you know what it is, but it's not in words, and it's also not in images. You're not imagining a cat on the mat. You're just having the content that the cat is on the mat, kind of like an abstract content, but without the words and without any other kind of sensory manifestation of it. That's how I would explain it.
Yeah, well explained. I think that was really good. This was probably the experience that for me I had the highest error bars on. It was quite hard to really figure out if I was experiencing the words or was I just experiencing a concept. And the thing that really helped differentiate it for me, I think, was if there was a temporal dimension to it. Did the sentence evolve over time? But even then, I was kind of thinking like, well, did it? I don't know. Because how do you know? Like I was trying, did I experience those words? Did I say it? I think it was in my accent, but are all of my like this was definitely the one that I had in the. I think there's some. I think people think a lot of their thinking is in language when really it is a more abstract, maybe a more efficient sort of information processing in the brain. And language emerges when we want to do sort of an encoding decoding process where I'm encoding those abstract thoughts into language. I communicate it to you and you don't really process it maybe on a language level either. It has to get decoded into whatever sort of abstract information processing the brain really works on. So it's kind of an illusion to us that all thinking is at the language level, but there's really like some sort of more efficient compressed information form underneath that we maybe don't have conscious access to, we don't really understand, but it all seems like language. Would you agree
Yes,
with that? Do you think that's sort of how you think about it?
I think so. And the view that thought is language like has a long pedigree, has had a huge influence. So it's not just common sense, it's also probably the most influential theory that anybody's come up with about how thought operates. So it's natural that we're kind of enculturated into it, and so we have this expectation. And so then when we try to report what we're thinking,
Yes.
we report that we were speaking in our head. We had this inner speech. But it's partially because the observation itself is kind of theory laden, and we apply our preconceptions to it, and that's
Yes.
where Russ is so good, because he kind of tries to like dismantle your presuppositions, and try to get at something more faithful, as he says, or more accurate, I would say.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think there's a problem in saying more accurate. And the only reason why I didn't fall for the whole inner speech thing is because I had that other experience something like 15 years ago, where I tested myself and I discovered that, yeah, in fact, I do have unsymbolized thoughts. So
Right.
I was already kind of beyond the standard presupposition.
Yes. The amount of comments that came in where I was like, boy, if I could just unleash Russ on you, you would be destroyed. Like you would go from 100% confidence to 5% confidence in 10 minutes of questioning. Because like even on the first couple of samples, I might say something and have reasonable degrees of confidence. And then the more questions went on, I'd be like, God, that's a good question. And I'd be really scratching my head and I'd be like, God, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, but didn't you feel like you got better over
Yes.
time?
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
so
For sure.
by like hearing the questions and then kind of letting them percolate, when you do it again, you are better at focusing on what's actually happening, and maybe using fewer of your own filters and presuppositions, and
For sure.
in trying to write down what you think was happening.
Yeah. I'm
So,
really curious on the relationship between aphantasia and inner speech. Do you know if there's anything in the literature connecting those two phenomena?
I'm not very familiar with the literature on aphantasia, but I would say that um, there is at least one plausible view that aphantasia is unconscious imagery.
Yes.
Um, and I think there's something to that, but I also think that um, there's an analogy between, when aphantasics, people with aphantasia imagine things, sensory things like visual imagination, and when people have unsymbolized thoughts, because an unsymbolized thought could also be considered a kind of unconscious language imagery. But
Right.
I don't know that that's all there is to it, or that's actually that the best way to think about it. So there might just be an ability of our brains to abstract away from the sensory vehicle, be it visual in the case of visual imagination, or be it language, which is still a kind of sensory vehicle. It can be verbal, or it can be auditory, or it can be written down, and therefore visual, or it can be braille, so
Tactile.
it's
Yeah. Right.
touch.
Yeah.
So abstract away from the sensory vehicle and just generate populations of neurons that represent the concepts themselves without their vehicle. So I
Right.
think that maybe there is an analogy there between unsymbolized thoughts and the kinds of imagination that goes on for somebody who has aphantasia.
Interesting. I had never made that connection. I was speaking to Dr. Adam Zeman a couple of weeks ago, who coined the term aphantasia in 2015. So is one of the, definitely one of the largest researchers in the field.
Yeah.
And he's a real he likes this idea of unconscious imagery. And he brought up a really good point where if you didn't have unconscious imagery, it seems hard to believe that you would have perfect object recognition. Like you can, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe you have a different opinion. If someone with aphantasia can see an apple, or can see a TV, or can see an elephant, and immediately, and I believe they might have slightly slower object recognition, but it's not noticeably slower. It's not significantly slower, but it's maybe slightly. And they
Mhm.
recognize that object as being a TV, an apple, or a giraffe. That they have that image in their head somehow. I think the only other way potentially that they're encoding that information is semantically, and that seems like a harder task. Like if they see a giraffe, are they really connecting, okay, long neck, mammal, yellow, brown spot, and kind of putting the jigsaw together and saying that's a giraffe? Like it feels much more likely that they have that almost immediate object recognition because they are matching that image, right? Would you agree with that? I'm curious in your thoughts.
That's a very interesting question, Evan. And I'm going to take this from kind of a sideway direction.
Do it.
I think we need to go beyond these analogies with public representations, meaning, images or language. So this is what we've been using to think about mental processes for a long time. Or is thought imagistic or is thought linguistic? Maybe it's neither.
Maybe neither.
Or maybe
More
some
abstract.
aspects of it are neither.
Interesting.
And this idea has been articulated very well by a pair of young philosophers. Their names are Alfredo Vernazzani and Dimitri Coelho-Mollo. They've published one paper in Philosophy of Science in 2023, I believe. And then they have another paper coming out in an edited volume that I'm putting together that's coming out now. It's called Neurocognitive Foundations of Mind. It's coming out in any day now, like in a week or so,
Cool.
from Routledge. And they argue that these analogies are too limiting for understanding neural representation.
Right.
And we need to understand neural representation sort of in its own right by looking at the way different representations constrain each other and constrain the processes that operate on them. And, I would add, we can also consider whether these representations give rise to conscious experience or not, specifically in the context of a descriptive experience sampling paradigm where we can try to figure out whether we're conscious of something in the moment that it's happening on its own. So going back to the question, do we have imagery? What do you mean by imagery? We certainly don't have any conscious imagery when we recognize objects. None of us do. We, recognize the object. We look and we see, oh yeah, this is a computer. This is a notebook. This is a pair of glasses or whatever. Of course, that requires some information present in your brain that helps you do that recognition. But I don't know that it helps anything to call that imagery. With respect to then what you might be conscious of as what we call imagery, like, oh, imagine this, imagine that. There's individual differences. Some people imagine things very vividly, and some people imagine things with no vividness almost at all. And those are the aphantasics. And I think there's a question of, what's the difference there? Certainly, there's going to be something in common because both of these populations, or like all these populations, it's a whole spectrum. Typically, everybody can at least tell a few things based on what they're imagining, even though some of them, can have the sensation of the imagined things, imagined situations, and others don't. So they have something in common, but there's also important differences. So that's important, and then we need to study that. And I know some people are studying that, but there's important differences. Like people who have vivid imagery can tell you a lot more details about what they're imagining than the people who don't have the vividness.
Yes.
And I mean, I think, I have noticed this, when we've compared our DS experiences, like, you can imagine things and say, oh yeah, like I even see like the stones on the imaginary wall and the divisions between the stones and the grass around it and the color of that. Whereas if I imagine a wall, I don't even see the wall itself. I mean, I can just have a sense, like a vague sense that there's a wall, but not like I don't see the wall. I don't experience the wall. I certainly don't experience stones in the wall. And I don't experience like grass around the wall, and definitely zero color whatsoever. So
right,
those are big differences.
For sure. I can still, as soon as you mention it, I can still bring up that image in my mind of the stone wall in the Irish countryside with the blue sky. Again, just the most peaceful image that I think someone can have. Yeah, you bring up a good point that these sort of words that we use, like imagery, in the brain, are sort of metaphors, and we don't really know how that information is encoded. Like in my mind, it was like you could encode sort of a visual image in some bank, or you can encode it semantically. But in the same way, we don't really know the abstract way that information is processed really in the brain once you get all the way down to the nuts and bolts. We don't really understand how we're doing that object recognition either. So you think that you would say that you wouldn't necessarily lean for that unconscious imagery idea, because it could just be that you're encoding the information in a completely different way, and there might be as much variance in the way that people with aphantasia encode images as there is as much variance in the visual imagery spectrum in the first place. Is that
Yeah, I think a lot of information. This is like a mainstream idea from the whole connectionist neurocomputational tradition. A lot of information in the brain and neural systems is encoded implicitly in the connectivity structure and the strength of the connectivity between neurons and neural systems and neural structures. That doesn't mean that it's all just in the synapses or in the synaptic strength. There could be more to it. I am not defending the view that all there is to memory is synaptic strength, but I am saying that a lot of what's used, known, and encoded is implicit in the patterns of connectivity and the strength of the connectivity. Um, and those things get activated on an as needed basis. They're not usefully conceived of as kind of computational data structure in the sense in which digital computers store information. They're not like memory registers with bit structures stably
right?
maintained inside these registers. It's all implicit and it's all kind of graded knowledge or information in these patterns, and then it gets activated when needed based on either external inputs coming in, for example, from the sensory system if you're trying to recognize something, but also it can be activated by internal patterns of activity or a combination of the two. So if that information is there implicitly and the stimuli are of a certain kind, or maybe there's also prediction coming from the top down, you can activate the right kind of pattern that tells you it's a dog, it's a clock, it's a computer. You can recognize things not because you're literally matching one data structure to another, but simply because a certain pattern of neural activity gets activated thanks to a combination of what's coming in from the input side, what's coming in from the top down prediction side, and what's implicitly known and coded by the connectivity and strength of connectivity of the system.
Right.
So to me, that's a different way of thinking than you have to have imagery and then you compare your image to like what's coming in.
Yeah.
That would require like different memory structures where in one you hold the image, in one you hold the new pattern, and then you compare, like you have some kind of comparison system that tries to match these things. But I doubt that there's anything like that really happening.
Really well explained. It's so cool. There's just so much that's unknown in this field. Why do you think inner experience as an area hasn't picked up more steam, hasn't got more funding, hasn't got more researchers? Is it because inherently subjectivity is murky and a bit messy, and people don't really want to touch subjectivity when they can go to a hard quantitative field where they can measure stuff directly? And inner experience is in the most subjective field of study you could possibly have. But I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't picked up more field. I'm surprised there isn't even more industries that aren't interested in funding that research, like drug industries. I'm surprised big pharma hasn't gotten all over in their experience as a field and be like, we want to understand what people experience when they're on SSRIs, when they're on anti-epileptics. And there's seems so many both industrial and academic things that could come out of this field, but it's quite nascent. It's quite small.
Well, um, that's a huge question, Evan. Um, so I would qualify that by saying there are people who study inner experience in various ways.
Yeah.
Most of them are not as careful and rigorous as Russell Hurlburt, at least to some degree. But you're right that in mainstream psychology and cognitive neuroscience, at most, people will use some kind of subjective report within a more traditional experimental paradigm, in which the task is very well defined. Most of the potential distractors are eliminated by the experimental design. There and the subject may be asked some information about what happens in their mind, but that's only to provide some other information that couldn't be gotten otherwise. For example, binocular rivalry studies where they present two different stimuli to the two eyes, and typically people only consciously experience one of the two stimuli. They'll ask you, which one are you experiencing at any given time?
Right.
Are you experiencing the house or the face? Oh, now I'm seeing the face, now I'm seeing the house. Okay, so you have to tell, and then they put you in a scanner and they try to see which parts of your brain are active when you're experiencing one or the other. So there's subjective aspects to even some of this mainstream science, but in this case, this feels more like proper rigorous science because it's more controlled and you're only looking at a few variables at a time, or maybe one variable at a time. You try to isolate just one variable, and then you intervene there and you see what your intervention does. And that's the kind of the way that people think you need to do proper science. Some of this is influenced by the history of the field that went through a behaviorist phase in which inner experience was banned. That in that case was really banned. So the behaviorist said, the psychology is a study of behavior. It's not a study of the mind. But then if you go back, one reason they had for that is that some of the previous psychologists before them, they did use quote unquote introspection, but they ended up in all these complicated debates with each other. They couldn't agree about how to do it, how much they could learn from the mind about it, and they had different assumptions and they were doing it different ways, and they purported to be finding different things. And so the behavior said, enough about that. That's not science. So maybe we haven't fully recovered from that.
Right.
But I'd say even that, it was science. I mean, it might have had problems, but they're not unsolvable. So, we should definitely consider using methods like DES in combination with other measures as well, because I think there's a lot we can learn from that.
I'm curious if you mentioned binocular rivalry. There's a really cool paradigm for testing aphantasia with binocular rivalry bias. Have you heard of this, where they'll get people to basically, so if you imagine the image that you're going to be shown before you are, it will bias which of the two objects you see in your binocular rivalry. And then if you do that over 100, I think it's 100 or maybe even more, 100 samples, you can actually put someone on the visualization spectrum because of how capable they are at biasing the result of their binocular rivalry by their own visualization. So my intuitively, if you don't have that visualization, you would still basically land 50-50 because you're not biasing your perceptual system on which of the objects you see, whereas people with very strong imagery can very strongly bias what their result is on their binocular rivalry. And then over enough samples, you can actually map people pretty well along the spectrum, and those results correlate really well with VVIQ, which is the visual vividness imagery questionnaire. It's Dr. Joel Pearson, I think, who has pioneered these methods in Australia. I had a conversation with him. It's really interesting because it's one of those methods of turning the subjective objective, where he's able to use objective phenomena to really map someone on the spectrum. And I think it's really interesting that those results, I think, very strongly correlate with VVIQ. I think you should do that because that would be fun to experiment to see. There's also the pupillometry. You've heard of the pupil dilation studies where if you imagine a bright object, your pupil will dilate, and you can measure the quantity of dilation, and then that will also chart you basically on the visual imagery distribution.
I think I have heard about this once.
Yeah.
What I find this really fascinating and valuable for is the debate over whether there isn't even such a thing as aphantasia. So there's some people are so skeptical of introspection, broadly speaking, that
Yeah.
they don't even necessarily believe that there is such a thing because they don't believe that you can tell the difference. And maybe the most prominent is Eric Schwitzgebel. And Eric Schwitzgebel and I once went, he's a philosopher, and he's written a lot about how introspection is unreliable and questionable. And I mean, that's a helpful counterpoint. We need to be aware of the challenges, but he goes a little too far. So one time he and I got into a disagreement on Facebook over whether there is aphantasia, with me saying, like, I have aphantasia, and he's like, I don't believe that. I think you're just reporting the same things that other people have in their mind in a different way. And then he said, well, to be fair, I haven't really looked up the literature in recent years, but what I would expect is that if aphantasia is real, there would be other cognitive differences that would correlate with it. And I was sure that there would be, and the ones you're listing are in fact confirmation, validation, even by the standards of somebody like Eric Schwitzgebel. So if he were hearing this, he would hopefully be at least moved by some of these studies.
There's some really good fMRI work as well. I'm relatively familiar with the literature at the moment because I'm working for a company called Aphantasia Network. I'm not sure if we've actually discussed this properly. I'm basically designing a course for therapists to adapt their visualization practices for people with aphantasia. So there's some evidence that people with aphantasia who just have another sort of any sort of condition like depression or just anxiety or anything, they will do CBT and get worse results because these positive visualization exercises, of course, don't work. So but there's also evidence that you can adapt those visualization practices to be more verbal and conceptual. So if you, instead of visualizing your safe place, you would describe it verbally, like, I'm in my grandmother's kitchen, I can hear this, you basically just list out conceptually and verbally the safe place, and this seems to work with them. It seems to evoke the same emotional response. You just need to get to the visualization in a different way. So I would very much disagree that aphantasia doesn't exist. I think there's really good fMRI studies now. There's good associations that correlate with VVIQ scores, which is again how well you visualize. That correlates with things like prefrontal cortex to visual cortex connectivity. And I just think that so many people have come forward now saying that this is their experience. I mean, Adam Zeman's surveys of 4,000, 5,000 people, really large surveys, show that the incidence it's between 2 and 5% is what the literature says. Some people say 4, some people say 5%, which is 1 in 20, which seems crazy. It seems really, really high. But interestingly, on the cognitive differences, that they aren't huge. The cognitive differences aren't that massive. You still have people with aphantasia going into creative fields, which seems a bit crazy. They seem slightly overrepresented in STEM, which is really interesting. You get a lot of like theoretical physicists, these really abstract areas. Of course, you're a consciousness philosopher, so like,
I'm not that surprised by that, because I think it has something to do with why I went into philosophy, which is a pretty abstract field.
yes,
And why I don't really enjoy novels as much as most other people seem to. Because to me, like, yeah, I'm reading the words, I understand what they mean, but like it doesn't evoke these vivid images that it evokes in other people. That people say, like, yeah, I can picture this.
yeah.
And I cannot picture it, so it's not as fun to read that.
But the interesting thing, and I think this is where it really shows that variance is the norm rather than like variance is absolutely the standard. My sister has aphantasia and is probably one of the largest Harry Potter fans in the world. She has read every single one of those books like 10 times. And she's never been able to visualize, I mean, she's never been able to visualize anything that happens in those books, but she'll just keep rereading them. And why that is, I have absolutely no idea. Doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But you're right. I think you're right that in general they aren't attracted to like fantasy novels, science fiction novels, things that generally would evoke imagery where the imagery is somewhat important to the story. There's just so much variance.
Yes.
So interesting. So interesting.
It is.
Another. Do you have a sense of when your imagery profile or your inner experience profile is laid down in development? I was thinking about this idea of, you know, as you're developing and as you're growing and you know, as you're getting older, one, how stable is your inner experience over time? I don't think we've done longitudinal studies on this, but I'd be curious. Maybe we have done a few, but I'm curious on how you think the inner experience profile is laid down over time. Like, what is it that decides if someone inner speaks or not? What is it that decides if people can inner see or not? Like, what is happening in the developmental process that is different between people that experience the world in such radically different ways?
Yeah, interesting question. What I would say is that there's this other idea that's also been around at least since Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist and neurologist. I think he was also a neurologist, but anyway, certainly a psychologist. And he was a developmental psychologist. And so he talks about internalizing language and then using inner speech to think. So he's thinking, you know, this idea is that we learn language, public language, and then we internalize it, and then we can kind of speak to ourselves. And that's how we think, which we already said is not the whole story, because there's also unsymbolized thought.
Yeah.
But variations of this idea have had a lot of impact. And you can generalize it from language to other sensory motor patterns or stimuli. Like, it doesn't have to be language that you internalize. You can internalize any patterns of experience and action that you go through. And there's plenty of evidence that we do that. Like the whole, what happens when you sleep, you know, for example, these experiments with mice showing that the neurons in their, you know, the neurons that represent location in a maze, or the neurons that represent head direction, they undergo the same patterns that they undergo when they're awake, even when they're asleep. So it's a form of internalizing sensory motor patterns and then reusing them, you know, for other purposes in your sleep, maybe for learning purposes, or maybe even when you're awake for the purpose of figuring out where to go in a maze or what to do in a new situation, by using in a creative way what you've already experienced in other situations like that. So, and Georgi Buzaki is a neuroscientist who's like kind of makes a big deal out of this. You know, he wrote a whole book, The Brain Inside Out.
He's the guy. I thought that was him. Yeah.
He talks about this. And I think he has a point. I mean, he's not the only one. Okay, this idea has been around, and it's definitely mainstream neuroscience. But um, but where I'm going with this is that there might be another step. So you internalize a sensory motor pattern, or a system of patterns. Like in the case of language, it's a whole way of speaking that language. You can activate it internally. You can activate it internally in a creative way, meaning you interspeak novel sentences in your head. But maybe at some point, it might take a while, in development, you can reach a place where you develop neural structures, neural systems, that can represent what language would represent, or in the case of navigation, what your navigation system represents, or in the case of vision, what your visual system would represent. But you can represent all of that without the sensory motor pattern, just the content itself, so to speak. Or it can become more abstracted or amodal, as sometimes neuroscientists call it. It's not as tied to a specific sensory modality or a sensory vehicle. So you just think that thought without the words, or without the image, the visual image or the auditory image, and so forth. And so maybe this is just one more step of this internalization development, or process. First you internalize the sensory motor stuff, and then you just internalize the abstract pattern without the sensory motor aspect of it. And some people go farther than others, but I do think there's evidence that people, as they age, or as they develop and age, they move away from the sensory motor pattern. So as you get older, you do more thinking that's unsymbolized and less inner speech, or in the
I
case of
didn't know that.
aphantasics.
That's interesting. That's been mapped out, so that we do have some good longitudinal ideas of how inner experience changes over time. Little bits.
I don't know if this has been studied rigorously.
Okay.
As I have anecdotal evidence of this, and I have a sense that I think I remember reading that for aphantasics, it kind of gets more pronounced as they get older. I would say this fits my own case as well. Like, I remember more vivid images when I was younger than I have now. So yeah, so developmentally, there seems to be a process of sort of developing the ability to think thoughts with less and less ties to the sensory motor grounding of it, if you will.
Very interesting. Those are the kind of, like, there's all of these stories are gene plus development, gene plus environment stories, right? But they're so hard to really find answers to them, because I would love to know when someone first starts getting imagery, but it's extremely hard to ask a 1-year-old, impossible to ask a 1-year-old if they have imagery.
Yes.
So there's all of these really interesting questions I'd love to know of, like, when does inner speech start, or when might inner speech on average start? Um, and what are in the cases where it doesn't start, is there any environmental thing that's going on there? Is there any, but it's so hard to, like, how will we ever find answers to those questions, because we can't reliably get answers out of developing toddlers, and we can't really shove them into MRIs, and we don't have the technology to really figure out the signals directly from their brains. But I'd love to understand that gene development picture more as it pertains to inner experience, and how that morphs and changes over time.
It's true, but we can do, I know, studies, and in that case, we can record from their neurons. Um, and so a lot of these sleep studies in mice, for example, show that mice do this, meaning whether they're conscious of it, at this point, it becomes difficult to tell. But certainly there are these internal patterns that mimic the patterns that these neural structures undergo when the mice are awake, and they happen when they're asleep. So They're internally generated. And I don't know when I start doing this, but they probably start pretty young. So it's a question on which there are ways of at least like getting a handle empirically, even though I'm not an expert on that, by maybe doing at least studying some of these some aspects of this in other species.
Although very hard, obviously, for inner speech, considering we're the only species that does that.
Yeah, good point.
Maybe parrots. Do parrots inner speak? We don't know. They mimic outwardly. Maybe I don't know if they mimic inwardly as well. I don't know. So many interesting questions here.
Yes.
Does anyone in your family have aphantasia? Because there is a genetic link.
Not that I know. I know my sister's the opposite of me. She has like very good memory, very good imagination.
Yeah, me and my sister are opposites as well. We did a VVIQ, and we had like 70 points difference between us. I think that's not even possible. 60 points difference between us, like some huge difference, which is strange because apparently in the literature there is genetic links, of course, because the genetic links for everything.
Yeah.
What about prosopagnosia? What's your facial recognition like?
It's definitely not the best. So I think I probably do have some deficits in object recognition, probably tied to, or they correlate with aphantasia. Yeah, it's hard for me to recognize people, especially out of context. If I run into them on the street, and this happened even just a few days ago, I ran into one of our university administrators on the street, and he immediately recognized me and said, "Oh yeah, da 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 da," and I'm thinking, who's this guy? I must have met him before. And from the things he was saying, I kind of reconstructed at least the fact that I should know who he is and so forth, but I still couldn't figure out who he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke with a Sadie Dingfelder probably over a year ago now, who has prosopagnosia, has aphantasia. She actually had a conversation with Russ. She actually introduced me to Russ in the first place, over a year ago now. She has all of these tragic but hilarious, and she laughs about it as well. I wouldn't laugh if she didn't laugh as well. Experiences where her sister or aunt, I can't remember which, gave her like a framed photo, and she like absolutely loved that framed photo. She was like, "This is a prized possession of mine. I love it so much." She like put it up on her desk, looked at it every single day. Like months went by, and that same family member came in and was like, "You're supposed to take the stock photos out of the frame." So like it came with a stock photo of two just people she'd never known, and she thought they were her family because she just doesn't have any facial recognition whatsoever. I'm like, that is hilarious, and tragic, and it's great that you're laughing at it so that I can laugh too. But it's like,
yeah.
You don't relate to that. That's an extreme.
No, that I'm nowhere near that.
Yeah.
No. I can recognize people.
Cool.
But it's probably a little harder than average, maybe.
Right. Let's go to the future of how you see these fields developing. How do you think we make really good progress in the fields of inner experience? If you had lots of money, any money you want, and even any artificial futuristic technology that you want for scanning the brain or scanning the body in any way that you wish, like what are the experiments that we want to do down the line to really decipher the mysteries of inner experience? I'm curious if you've thought about this at all.
I have. I think a good place to start would be to try to study unsymbolized thought in a more traditional scientific context, meaning, for example, looking at EEG patterns, looking at fMRI activation, like bold signal activation, to see, if we can correlate what happens when people have unsymbolized thought with other information we have about, brain networks that are involved in different functions, and maybe try to figure out, which parts of the brain are more involved in that kind of thing. And then we can learn something about that, because I think that's an especially understudied aspect of our mine because people haven't used methods like descriptive experience sampling for the most part in the context of mainstream cognitive neuroscience.
Right.
And I actually have proposed to my university to form a um, a team and get involved in this area and maybe pursue larger grants. But for now, I just asked for a internal grant to start a conversation, maybe put together a conference on this kind of topic, broader. But I called it the architecture of propositional thought, and I'm hoping that we can contribute to this conversation because I think there's a lot to do and there's also a lot to think about, because a lot of the traditional theories about it that inform the way people set up experiments and the way they study these things and the way they do modeling are inadequate.
Interesting. Do you think we have sufficiently high resolution technology to scan the brain during unsymbolized thought to really get at whatever the important signal in that noise is? Or do we need more technology? Do we need advancements in brain scanning technology?
Well, I think we can certainly learn a lot about it if we look for it based on
Yeah.
what we already have. Certainly, more refined technology is welcome, but at this time, I think we have tons and tons of data, and we need to get more refined and sophisticated in what we're looking for and in how we use the data and how we model the data. Of course,
Is
there's plenty of good people and good work being done on this. I'm not saying that there's
yeah.
something deeply wrong with the field, but there's room for innovation for sure.
Yeah, I always ask because I'm curious sort of what technology will be developed, where if people ever have in their heads sort of a new paradigm or something that will just unlock, right? Like something like optogenetics, right? Was just a big groundbreaking shift in how we can stimulate neuron circuits. I
Yes.
am and like I'm curious always if people have in their minds of like we're missing this type of technology that will do this kind of thing to look at the brain from a different angle or a different dimension or more holistically, record from more neurons. Like, what kind of secrets could be unlocked with that?
Yes.
Well,
There's definitely already a lot going on, and a lot of more powerful methods are being developed and applied right now, for like recording from even thousands of neurons at the same time in a brain, or tracking more of neural activity, at the same time using different detection methods. So yeah, people are improving their techniques.
for sure.
Yeah.
And what about that same question for the general field of consciousness? Like, how do you see us making big strides in consciousness over the next decade? What do we need to be doing? Where does the money need to go?
Uh, I'm going to try to write a book about this, and so when that comes
Awesome.
out, read it.
Awesome. I'll have you back on for round two. You're writing at the moment?
Well, I'm working on that. Yes, yes. It's a big project, so it's going to take a little bit of time, but
Anything you
I
can
do have
share
ideas
now?
about that. I'd say there's more aspects to consciousness than many people have realized, and it's not just are you conscious or are you not conscious? What's the hard problem of consciousness? There's different aspects, and each aspect deserves its own understanding, but we also need to put them all together, and that will give us a much better handle empirically and conceptually on consciousness. So yeah, I mean, I'm more involved in the theoretical and conceptual side of this than the experimental side.
Very cool. And
Yeah.
is that one of your motivations towards doing the DES in the first place? You wanted to bring that angle into the book and in general your workings on
It's
consciousness?
it's more interdependent than that. I already had, projects in this area, but after doing DES, it sort of helped me refocus my project I redesigned. Basically, I came up with a new project on consciousness, in part thanks to the DES experience that I had. So yeah, it was a big deal for me.
So cool. Gualtiero, this
Yeah.
has been so much fun. As I said, we've spent so many hours together now drilling into my experience, but it was fun to be able to throw the questions back in your direction.
Yeah.
I thought that was really, really entertaining. I think we covered a lot of things. I think we're gonna have thousands of people now triggering their alarms to go off in the middle of the night and severely pissing off their partners, boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands.
No. Put it with earpods in your ears directly, and you shouldn't be waking up anybody else.
And as you frantically scribble everything down or speak into a note, try and not wake up your entire house.
Right, that might be more disruptive. Yeah.
This has been so much fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anything else that you wanted that you don't think we touched on, inner experience, consciousness, or we leave it there? I thought that was such a fun
I think we can leave it
conversation.
there, but thank you. Yes, I had a lot of fun too.
Really appreciate it.
If you made it this far, then you must at least partially be interested in brain science. And who can blame you? It is the most interesting topic in the world. Twice per week, I talk to the most amazing neuroscientists in the entire world. So if you're interested, then subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below who you'd like me to speak to next. And thank you so much for your ongoing support.